The stasis glass of the great sepulchre shattered inward with a shockwave of golden fire that threw me violently across the polished marble floor. A blinding beam of pure, incandescent light had pierced straight through the planetary crust of Baal, striking the dead primark sarcophagus and rewriting the laws of life and death before my very eyes. Today, the blood of the great angel will flow warm once more, and the maddening curse that has damned his sons for 10,000 years will finally, permanently be broken. I will witness the impossible breath that silences the screaming tower of Amviro, and I will watch the towering lords of the blood angels fall to their knees as their murdered father rises from the ashes of history. The universe has changed in a matter of seconds, for the God Emperor has awakened on Terra, and his very first act of divine will is to reach across the cold stars and pull his most beloved son back from the void. I am a crypt-serf, a biologically baseline human bred for the singular, generational purpose of sweeping the eternal dust from the resting place of Sanguinius. My family line has lived and died in the suffocating dark of this subterranean cathedral for 10,000 years. We are creatures of the shadows, accustomed to the scent of stale incense, old copper, and the crushing, heavy sorrow that defines the Blood Angels chapter. My world is a silent one, usually interrupted only by the heavy, armored footfalls of the sanguinary guard or the distant, feral howling of the Death Company, those tragic demigods who have succumbed to the Black Rage, forever trapped in the psychic echo of their father's agonizing death. We are taught by the chaplains that the galaxy is a dying, rotting carcass, and that our only duty is to maintain the pristine beauty of the great angel's tomb until the stars finally burn out. But whispers had trickled down from the high astropaths in recent days, frantic, terrifying rumors that the master of mankind had finally risen from his throne on Terra. The stories claimed he had shed his mortal decay, accepted the sprawling faith of the ecclesiarchy, and become a true, weaponized god of order capable of bending reality to his will. I had dismissed these rumors as the desperate delusions of a dying empire, the final fever dream of humanity before the demons consumed us all. Yet as I lay trembling on the shattered marble, bathed in a light that was too perfect and too pure for this ruined galaxy, I knew the rumors were merely a shadow of the truth. This was not a weapon firing from the throne world. This was a divine mandate, sent across the warp to find the one son whose death had broken the heart of the Imperium. The golden beam that had penetrated the ceiling did not burn the ancient tapestries or scorch the stone, it healed them. The deep, jagged fissures in the crypt walls, scars left over from when the Tyrannid hive fleets nearly consumed our world, began to seamlessly knit themselves back together like living flesh. The dust of millennia that I had spent my entire life hopelessly fighting was simply unmade, dissolved into motes of harmless, floating light. I could feel the miraculous energy saturating my own frail form. The chronic ache in my lungs from breathing crypt spores completely vanished, and the terrible, arthritic bend in my spine snapped into perfect, painless alignment. The God Emperor's aura had enveloped Baal, and he was actively purging the despair from its bedrock. My eyes were drawn back to the center of the room, to the massive, golden sarcophagus where the Primarch had rested in state for 10 millennia. The stasis field, a marvel of forgotten technology designed to hold time itself at bay, had completely collapsed. But the body of Sanguinius was not decaying. The golden light from Terra was pouring directly into his ruined chest, pooling in the fatal, catastrophic wounds inflicted by the archtraitor Horus so long ago. I watched in absolute, paralyzing awe as the shattered breastplate of his golden armor began to reforge itself, the metal flowing like liquid under the intense heat of his father's love. The most terrifying aspect of the miracle was the sudden, absolute silence. The Blood Angels are a chapter defined by their barely contained fury, a genetic curse that keeps them teetering on the edge of becoming monsters. The psychic backlash of Sanguinius's death created a permanent, screaming scar in the warp that slowly drives his sons insane. But I realized, with a shock that stopped my heart, that the distant howling from the Tower of Amuro had ceased. That Scar was being cauterized. The horrific visions of the traitor's flagship, the endless cycle of dying their father's death over and over again, had been violently pushed out of their minds by the overwhelming presence of the God Emperor. He was not just healing the physical flesh of the great angel, he was healing the poisoned soul of the entire bloodline. Heavy, frantic footsteps echoed down the grand spiraling staircase that led into the crypts. A squad of sanguinary guard, the absolute elite of the chapter, burst into the burial chamber with their weapons drawn and energized. They had come expecting a demonic incursion, believing the sudden power surge to be an attack by the forces of chaos. Instead, these towering, immortal warriors skidded to a halt, their weapons lowering to the floor as they beheld the impossible sight. They stood frozen, their angelic death masks reflecting the blinding, starlit glow of the resurrection. Inside the shattered sarcophagus, beneath the pouring pillar of divine light, the impossible happened. The massive, pristine white wings of the primark, feathers that had been stiff and lifeless for 10,000 years, gave a sudden, violent twitch. The massive, pristine white wings of the primark twitched a second time, not with the random spasm of decaying muscles, but with the deliberate, agonizing effort of a soul forcing its way back into the material universe. I pressed my face against the cold, shattered marble of the crypt floor, my hands trembling so violently I could barely support my own weight. The squad of sanguinary guard, towering golden giants who represented the absolute pinnacle of the blood angel's martial pride, remained completely paralyzed. These were immortal warriors who would willingly charge into the screaming maws of demon engines without a moment of hesitation, yet they were entirely undone by the sight of feathers moving in the still air of the tomb. The blinding pillar of light from holy terror continued to pour into the shattered chest plate of Sanguinius, fusing the ancient, broken auramite back together with the heat of a newly born star. Then came the breath. It was a sound that completely defied the natural order of the cosmos, a massive, desperate intake of air that pulled the very oxygen from the vast subterranean chamber. It did not sound like the raspy, failing breath of a wounded soldier, nor the mechanical hiss of a life support respirator. It was the sound of a hurricane being born in a confined space. The sheer force of that inhalation stirred the heavy, embroidered tapestries hanging along the crypt walls and sent the floating motes of golden dust spinning into frantic vortexes. I felt the air pressure drop significantly, popping my ears as the perfectly healed lungs of the great angel expanded for the first time in 10 millennia. His broad, armored chest rose with terrifying power, completely shattering the remaining shards of the stasis-glass that had entombed him. The heavy, ornate weapons of the sanguinary guard slipped from their nerveless, gauntleted fingers, striking the polished stone floor with heavy, metallic finality. They did not care. They were not looking at their armaments, nor were they scanning the shadows for hidden threats. Their angelic death masks, sculpted to reflect the tragic, frozen visage of their murdered father, were fixed entirely upon the sarcophagus. As the primarch exhaled his first breath, a wave of pure, concentrated psychic nobility washed over the room. It was an invisible tide that carried the scent of ancient, pristine air and the overwhelming sensation of absolute, unconditional love. I am nothing but a lowly crypt-serf, a microscopic speck of dirt in the grand machinery of Baal. Yet when that wave passed through my frail body, I felt a sudden, fierce urge to weep. It was not the weeping of sorrow, which I had known my entire life, but the tears of a child who realizes they are finally safe from the dark. For 10,000 years, the sons of Sanguinius have fought a losing battle against their own genetics. The red thirst and the black rage were a dual curse, a ticking clock of madness that guaranteed every blood angel would eventually devolve into a mindless, blood-starved beast, reliving the agonizing death of their patriarch. But as the primarch drew his second, steady breath, I physically witnessed that ancient curse being unraveled. The tense, tightly coiled posture of the sanguinary guard completely dissolved. The predatory aura that always clung to them, the terrifying sense that they were barely restraining a monstrous hunger, simply evaporated into the golden light. One of the towering warriors reached up with trembling hands and disengaged the seals of his golden helm. He pulled the death mask free, revealing a face deeply scarred by centuries of brutal warfare. He was openly sobbing, his genetically modified eyes wide with a disbelief that was rapidly transforming into religious rapture. The psychic wound in his soul had been cauterized. Sanguinius opened his eyes. They were not the clouded, lifeless orbs of a preserved corpse, nor were they filled with the lingering pain of the archtraitor's final, fatal blow. They were pools of brilliant, bottomless gold, reflecting the exact same divine fire that now radiated from the awakened God Emperor on Terra. The great angel did not look confused or disoriented by his resurrection. There was a profound, terrifying clarity in his gaze, an understanding that he had not been spared from death, but weaponized by it. The galaxy had burned in his absence, his sons had suffered unspeakable horrors, and the dream of the Imperium had rotted into a nightmare. But as he slowly sat up, his massive, pristine wings unfolding to their full, glorious span, the oppressive despair of the current age was entirely banished from the crypt. He was so massive, so impossibly beautiful and terrible, that my mind struggled to comprehend his physical dimensions. The golden armor that had been famously shattered by Horus was now completely whole, gleaming with an inner light that cast long, crisp shadows across the burial chamber. He rose from the sarcophagus, his armored boots touching the marble floor with absolute silent grace. The sanguinary guard fell to their knees simultaneously, their massive frames bowing so low that their foreheads rested against the stone. They could not speak. The emotional weight of the moment had completely robbed them of their voices. The primark looked down at his weeping, kneeling sons, his golden eyes filled with an infinite, tragic compassion. And then his gaze shifted, past the towering demigods in their golden armor, past the shattered remnants of his ancient tomb, his eyes locked directly onto me. A filthy, terrified crypt-serf huddled in the dust. The absolute master of the blood angels, the most beloved son of the God Emperor, looked at a man whose only purpose was to sweep the floor, and I felt my soul entirely laid bare before his divine light. The first spoken words of a murdered primark shattered the remaining stained glass of the subterranean cathedral, demanding answers from a universe that had left him rotting in the dark for 10 millennia. I, a trembling crypt-serf whose only purpose in life was to sweep the eternal dust from his tomb, suddenly found myself burdened with explaining the absolute nightmare of the current age to a resurrected demigod. The towering sanguinary guard were completely paralyzed by a sudden, overwhelming religious rapture, entirely unable to speak as the great angel realized his father had permanently abandoned the secular imperial truth. He was about to turn his golden eyes toward holy Terra, and the sheer psychic shock of discovering the God Emperor's ascension would forever alter the tragic destiny of the blood angels. The universe seemed to hold its collective, terrified breath as Sanguinius stepped fully away from his ruined, golden sarcophagus. His armored boots moved with a fluid, impossible grace that completely defied his massive size and the heavy plates of auramite he wore. I remained frozen against the chilled marble of the floor, my breath caught painfully in my throat as those bottomless, radiant golden eyes remained fixed directly upon me. He did not see a filthy, insignificant laborer. His gaze pierced straight through my frail physical form, reading the absolute terror, the lifetime of crushing, generational sorrow, and the newborn, burning faith etched deeply into my soul. I fully expected to be annihilated, vaporized into ash by the sheer psychic weight of his divine attention, but instead, the crushing atmospheric pressure in the crypt began to ease. The radiant, starlit aura surrounding him was not a weapon of indiscriminate destruction, but a mantle of profound, unconditional protection that warmed the freezing air of the burial chamber. "You have kept the dark at bay, little one," the primark whispered. His voice was a harmonic resonance that vibrated through the very marrow of my bones, stripping away decades of accumulated fear. It was a voice perfectly designed by the Emperor to command immediate planetary compliance, to inspire millions of mortal soldiers to willingly march into the fires of extinction with smiles on their faces, yet it was laced with a gentle, tragic melancholy. He slowly extended a massive, gauntleted hand, the metal glowing with the residual heat of his miraculous resurrection, and gestured for me to rise. My legs shook violently, my arthritic joints popping loudly in the silent tomb, but I found myself standing. I, a nameless, forgotten crypt-serf whose ancestors had all died in this very room's sweeping dust, was standing at strict attention before the absolute pinnacle of human genetic perfection. Sanguinius then turned his attention back to the golden giants kneeling upon the floor. The sanguinary guard, the most elite, stoic, and lethal warriors of the entire chapter, were completely undone by his presence. Their master-crafted weapons lay abandoned on the stone. Their massive shoulders shook as centuries of brutally repressed grief, combined with the sudden, miraculous absence of the black rage in their minds, poured out of them in silent, racking sobs. "My sons weep," the primarch said, his voice echoing up into the vaulted shadows of the high ceiling. He looked around the damaged crypt, taking in the deep, newly healed fissures in the stone and the faded, ancient tapestries depicting his own brutal death. "And the air of my home tastes of a long, bitter decay, recently purged by a holy fire. How long have I slept in the dark?" One of the sanguinary guard, a veteran whose armor was heavily decorated with the bloody honors of 100 brutal campaigns against the alien and the mutant, struggled desperately to lift his head. He reached up and removed his golden death mask, his genetically enhanced face twisted in an expression of transcendent awe and lingering, paralyzing disbelief. He opened his mouth and tried to speak, but his vocal cords, accustomed only to roaring battle cries and solemn oaths of vengeance, failed him completely. He choked on his own words, entirely overwhelmed by the holy radiance of his genetic father. The silence stretched, thick and impossibly heavy. I realized, with a sudden spike of sheer, cold panic, that the immortal demigods could not answer him. The terrible burden of delivering the truth fell to me. 10 millennia, my lord," I stammered, my voice cracking, sounding impossibly small and frail in the vastness of the cathedral. Sanguinius froze. The great, pristine white wings on his back flared outward, catching the ambient golden light, as the absolute horror of that number struck his brilliant mind. 10,000 years. He closed his eyes, and I could physically feel the psychic shockwave of his grief ripple through the room, causing a sudden, sharp drop in temperature that iced the edges of the shattered stasis glass. He reached out with his mind, his consciousness expanding rapidly beyond the thick subterranean walls, past the radioactive, irradiated deserts of Baal, and into the terrifying void of the wider galaxy. I watched his perfect face contort in sudden, agonizing pain. He felt the horrific, deep scars left upon his homeworld by the endless swarms of the Tyrannid hive fleets. He felt the sickening, unnatural tear in reality that had split the Imperium in half, the great rift violently bleeding screaming demons into real space. He felt the countless billions of his sons who had died in absolute agony over the millennia, completely consumed by the madness of his own unavenged death. The tragedy of the galaxy crashed into him like a physical blow, and for a terrifying second, the golden light around him flickered. But then the Primarch turned his face toward the galactic north. He looked straight through the bedrock of Baal, his golden eyes widening in shock as his psychic senses locked onto the segmentum solar, tracing the origin of the light that had revived him. The sorrow completely vanished from his features, replaced by an expression of absolute, paralyzing revelation. The golden light from Terra, the divine tether that had reached across the stars to knit his flesh back together, was pulsing with an unimaginable, terrifying magnitude. He saw the Astronomican, no longer a desperate, flickering beacon fueled by psychic suffering, but a roaring, aggressive pillar of holy fire. He felt the sprawling, fanatical devotion of the ecclesiarchy, the very religious worship that the emperor had once violently despised and burned cities to eradicate, now woven seamlessly into the very fabric of his ascended being. And then, carried upon the currents of that holy light, Sanguinius heard the final, resonant echo of his father's ultimate act of warfare. He heard the words broadcast into the deepest, darkest corners of the warp, directed at the soul of the arch-traitor who had broken the galaxy. "I forgive you and I will wait for you," Sanguinius gasped, his eyes flying open. Horus, the beloved brother who had fallen to darkness, the monster who had crushed Sanguinius's windpipe and shattered his armor upon the vengeful spirit, the God Emperor had forgiven him. The Primarch's brilliant mind instantly grasped the absolute, terrifying genius of the act. The demons of the warp fed exclusively upon bitter hatred, betrayal, and endless, festering vengeance. By forgiving Horus, the Emperor had completely starved the dark gods of their most potent, limitless fuel. He had robbed them of the Horus heresy's lingering poison. "He has accepted the crown of thorns," Sanguinius whispered to the empty air, lowering his head in solemn, profound submission. "The age of reason and secular truth is ash. He has embraced the faith of mankind to become the god they needed, and he has forgiven my murderer to starve the dark." Sanguinius looked back down at the kneeling space marines, his golden eyes hardening with a new, terrifying resolve. The melancholy was gone, completely replaced by the righteous, unstoppable fury of an archangel called to a new, holy war. The era of the divine conqueror had truly begun, and the great angel was ready to draw his sword once more. The heavy adamantium vault doors at the apex of the grand spiraling staircase violently burst open, heralding the frantic arrival of Commander Dante, an ancient warrior who was about to throw his 15 centuries of agonizing warfare at the feet of a resurrected demigod. In this episode, a terrified and insignificant crypt-serf bear witness as the oldest and most battle-weary space marine in the galaxy is finally relieved of his unbearable crushing burden, and the psychic shockwave of the great angel's return permanently purges the horrific curse of the Black Rage from the very bedrock of Baal. The era of tragic, slow decay for the sons of Sanguinius was violently ending right before my eyes, replaced by the terrifying golden dawn of a new, unstoppable galactic crusade. Dante descended the ancient, worn steps of the crypt with a desperate urgency that entirely betrayed his legendary, stoic composure. He was the chapter master of the Blood Angels, a living myth whose golden armor was heavily scarred by the rending claws of tyrannid swarm lords and the dark, corrupting sorcery of demon princes. I had seen him only once before in my miserable life, from a great distance during a solemn procession, and he had moved with the slow, deliberate majesty of an emperor. Now he was practically throwing himself down the spiraling descent, his heavy, armored boots striking the stone with a frantic, uncoordinated rhythm. He had undoubtedly felt the massive psychic shockwave of the stasis field collapsing, and the sudden, terrifying silence that had fallen over the Tower of the Lost above us. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he stepped into the burial chamber, and the ambient, starlit glow of the resurrection caught the polished curves of his golden death mask. Dante froze completely mid-stride, his ancient, augmented joints locked into place as his gaze swept over the impossible scene before him. The shattered remnants of the stasis-glass, the elite sanguinary guard kneeling upon the floor in open weeping rapture, and finally, the towering, impossible figure of his genetic father standing perfectly whole in the center of the room. The great angel turned his brilliant, bottomless golden eyes upon his oldest, most exhausted son. The absolute magnitude of Dante's suffering, the sheer, crushing loneliness of leading a dying, genetically cursed brotherhood for over a millennium, was instantly and profoundly apparent to the Primarch's newly awakened divine senses. Sanguinius did not speak a word of reprimand for the fractured, bleeding state of the Imperium, nor did he demand a tactical report on the myriad, hopeless wars consuming their territories. He simply extended his massive arms, his pristine white wings folding slightly inward, offering an ancient gesture of profound, unconditional paternal love that had been entirely absent from the universe for 10,000 years. Dante's mastercrafted golden halberd slipped from his nerveless fingers, striking the polished marble floor with a heavy, metallic finality that echoed through the vaulted shadows. The ancient chapter master, a warrior who had stood unflinching and unbroken before the absolute greatest horrors the dark gods could manifest, completely and utterly broke down. He collapsed to his knees, his hands trembling violently as he reached up to unseal the pressurized collar of his helm. When the golden death mask hissed free, it revealed a face that was deeply lined, heavily scarred, and etched with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that transcended physical tiredness. But as he looked up into the glowing, compassionate eyes of his resurrected primark, that suffocating exhaustion was instantly swept away, replaced by a torrent of unashamed, weeping relief. "Father," Dante choked out, the single, desperate word carrying the staggering weight of 1 billion dead brothers and 100 ruined, forgotten campaigns. "You have returned to us, the long night. We truly believed the long night would never end." Sanguinius closed the distance between them in a single, fluid motion, his heavily armored boots making absolutely no sound upon the stone. He knelt gracefully, his massive, imposing frame completely dwarfing the ancient space marine, and placed a glowing, auramite-clad hand gently upon Dante's trembling shoulder. The touch was not merely physical contact, it was a potent, localized psychic balm that instantly cauterized the lingering, festering trauma in Dante's soul. I could physically feel the change in the air pressure as the endless, gnawing hunger of the red thirst, a horrific genetic curse that Dante had fought a daily, agonizing mental war to suppress for his entire incredibly long life, simply vanished into the purifying golden light. "You have borne a burden meant only for demigods, my son," Sanguinius whispered, his harmonic voice filling the vast, cold crypt with an undeniable, resonant warmth that brought fresh tears to my own eyes. "You have held the line in the absolute darkest of places, remaining unbroken when all hope was nothing but ash and memory. Your long, bitter vigil is over, Dante. The era of endurance has passed." The Primarch stood, his gaze sweeping over the kneeling elite guard and the weeping chapter master, before finally resting briefly on me, the lowly crypt-serf shivering in the shadows. The deep sorrow that had initially clouded his perfect features upon learning of the Imperium's horrific state was entirely gone. It was replaced by the terrifying, righteous focus of an archangel who had been explicitly resurrected by the God Emperor for one singular, uncompromising purpose: total, absolute war. As Sanguinius declared the end of their suffering, a second, more powerful psychic shockwave pulsed outward from his body, radiating upward through the thick bedrock of Baal. I felt it pass through me, a wave of pure, crystalline clarity. High above us, in the heavily fortified tower of Amuro, the miracle was completed. The Death Company, the tragic, doomed warriors permanently locked in the maddening hallucination of the Primarch's death, was suddenly awakened. The phantom pain of the arch-traitors, mace shattering their ribs, dissolved. The blinding, unquenchable rage was extinguished. For the first time in 10 millennia, the entire bloodline of Sanguinius was entirely sane, completely whole, and perfectly unified. "Rise, my sons," Sanguinius commanded, his voice no longer a gentle, mournful whisper, but a resonant, commanding boom that shook centuries of dust from the high ceiling. "We do not fight merely to survive the darkness anymore. We fight to aggressively conquer in his holy name. The Master of Mankind has called for a Golden Crusade, and the Blood Angels shall be his unstoppable vanguard." The shattered remnants of the stasis-glass ground to fine, glittering powder beneath the heavy, armored boots of a resurrected demigod, as Sanguinius finally ascended from his subterranean tomb to look upon the devastated surface of his homeworld. In this episode, I emerge from the suffocating dark of the crypts for the very first time in my miserable life, blinded by the harsh, radioactive sun of Baal, only to witness an entire planetary garrison of genetically cursed angels instantly healed of their madness. The alien monstrosities that still lurk in the poisoned wastes are about to learn the true, terrifying meaning of divine retribution. As the Lord of the Blood Angels unfurls his pristine wings under a sky he has not seen in 10,000 years. We are no longer guarding a silent grave. We are launching the vanguard of a golden, unstoppable crusade. The procession up the grand, spiraling staircase of the fortress monastery was a surreal, impossible dream. I, a genetically baseline crypt-serf whose entire lineage was born and buried in the dust below, walked in the direct wake of Sanguinius, Commander Dante, and the golden phalanx of the sanguinary guard. The air grew thinner and colder as we ascended toward the surface, the stale scent of ancient incense replaced by the bitter, metallic tang of irradiated wind leaking through the heavy adamantium blast doors. For my entire life, those doors represented the absolute edge of my reality. Beyond them lay the radioactive hellscape of Baal, a poisoned wasteland that would strip the flesh from my bones in a matter of hours. Yet, as the great angel approached the colossal gates, he merely raised a glowing, auramite-clad hand. The massive locking mechanisms, driven by centuries-old servitor motors, disengaged with heavy, mechanical finality, and the doors swung outward to reveal the harsh, bleeding sky of my homeworld. I squeezed my eyes shut, entirely blinded by my first exposure to actual sunlight. But the expected wave of searing, radioactive heat never arrived. Instead, the ambient, starlit aura that radiated from the resurrected primark expanded violently outward, forming a localized, protective atmospheric dome that pushed the toxic radstorms back. When I finally dared to open my newly healed eyes, I beheld a vista of unimaginable, heartbreaking devastation. The red sands of Baal were deeply scarred, covered in the massive, calcified bone towers and rotting bioships left behind by the Tyrannid hive fleets. It was a monument to the near extinction of the Blood Angels, a brutal testament to the agonizing price they had paid to simply survive. But the courtyard of the great fortress was not empty. Drawn by the massive psychic shockwave of the stasis field collapsing, the entirety of the chapter's presence on Baal had assembled. Thousands of towering space marines in deep crimson armor stood in perfectly ordered ranks, stretching out across the landing pads and ruined training grounds. Dropships hovered silently in the air, their engines idling. Every single warrior was completely motionless, their helmet lenses fixed upon the massive balcony where their murdered father now stood. The silence was absolute, a heavy, expectant void that threatened to crush my fragile mortal heart. Then, from the heavily fortified gates of the Tower of Amjuro, a different procession emerged. These warriors did not wear crimson, their armor was painted the deepest, most absorbing black, adorned with red crosses of salt and bone. They were the Death Company. Just hours ago, these men had been raving lunatics, their minds completely shattered by the black rage, doomed to violently hallucinate the final moments of the Primarch's life until they were mercifully killed in battle. Now, they walked in perfect, sane formation. They removed their black helmets as they marched, revealing faces streaked with tears of profound, agonizing relief. The psychic link that had permanently chained them to the horror of the Archtraitor's flagship had been entirely severed by the blinding light of the God Emperor's forgiveness. As the Death Company reached the front of the assembled host and fell to their knees on the red sand, a collective, shuddering breath was drawn by every space marine present. Sanguinius looked out over the sea of his sons, his golden eyes filled with an impossible mixture of deep sorrow for what they had endured and radiant, terrifying pride for their unbreakable resilience. He unfurled his massive, pristine white wings, the feathers catching the harsh sunlight and reflecting it back as pure golden fire. The psychic pressure of his presence was no longer just a localized warmth, it was a planetary event. Deep in the irradiated wastes, the surviving, feral remnants of the alien bioforms felt that pressure. The hive mind's connection had been severed long ago, but the primal, animalistic instinct of the tyrannid beasts recognized the sudden arrival of an apex predator that completely defied their biological logic. For the first time in their engineered existence, the monstrous creatures felt pure, unadulterated terror. The psychic weight of a fully awakened primark, charged with the weaponized faith of a newly ascended god, pressed down upon the poisoned sands of Baal, and the alien horrors began to violently burrow into the deep crust, desperately trying to flee the coming light. "You have bled upon these sands for 10 millennia, Sanguinius declared, his harmonic voice projecting across the vast courtyard without the need for vox amplifiers, striking the soul of every living being present. "You have fought the shadows, and you have fought the darkness within your own blood. But look upon me now, my sons, and know that the curse is broken." The great angel drew his legendary sword, the blade encarmine. As the weapon cleared its scabbard, it ignited with a roaring, golden plasma fire that rivaled the sun above. "The era of our suffering is dead," Sanguinius roared, his voice filled with the righteous, unstoppable fury of the divine. "Let the galaxy tremble, for the blood angels march to war, and we shall not stop until the stars themselves are cleansed." The skies above the irradiated wastes of Baal ignited with the furious, blinding exhaust of 1,000 mobilizing drop ships as the newly healed blood angels prepared to unleash 10 millennia of pent-up vengeance upon the stars. In this final chapter, I, a lowly crypt-serf who has only ever known the suffocating silent dark of a subterranean tomb, find myself standing on the grand command deck of a colossal strike cruiser bearing witness as the resurrected Sanguinius leads his golden armada into the warp to answer the God Emperor's call. The tragic, bleeding era of merely defending a rotting empire is officially and violently over, and the terrified alien remnants hiding beneath the sands of our homeworld are about to be reduced to atomic ash as the great angel finally takes flight. The galaxy is about to burn, not with the chaotic fires of the demon, but with the purifying, absolute light of divine retribution. The collective roar of the assembled space marines was a sound that defied mortal comprehension. It was not a battle cry born of desperate survival or the maddening, blood-starved frenzy of the Red Thirst. It was a unified, harmonic declaration of absolute victory, a sound so dense and heavy with righteous conviction that it physically shook the red dust from the high fortress walls. Commander Dante, standing at the right hand of his genetic father, raised his golden halberd toward the harsh sun, his face bathed in tears of pure, unadulterated joy. The Death Company, warriors who only hours ago were locked in the inescapable nightmare of their primarch's murder, now stood shoulder to shoulder with their sane brothers, their minds perfectly clear and their hearts burning with a singular, holy purpose. Sanguinius had not merely returned from the dead, he had brought the very soul of his legion back with him from the abyss. In the chaotic, beautiful frenzy of the mobilization, I fully expected to be left behind, discarded back into the shadows of the empty crypt where my ancestors had lived and died. I was a baseline human, a fragile creature of dust and sweeping brooms, entirely out of place among the towering demigods preparing for a galactic crusade. But as the massive, armored transports began to descend from the upper atmosphere, the great angel turned his radiant, bottomless golden eyes back toward me. He extended a hand, and with a voice that resonated with the absolute authority of a celestial king, he commanded that the one who had guarded his rest in the dark should now bear witness to the light. I was escorted not as a prisoner or a slave, but as an honored guest of the chapter, led up the massive boarding ramps by the towering sanguinary guard themselves. The ascent into the upper atmosphere of Baal was a revelation. Standing before the massive armor-glass viewing ports of the flagship's bridge, I looked down upon my ruined homeworld. The irradiated, toxic clouds that had choked the planet for centuries were being actively burned away by the psychic wake of the primark's presence. From the heavily fortified orbital docks, a massive armada of strike cruisers, battle barges, and escort frigates was breaking formation, their heavily armored hulls catching the light of the local star. For 10,000 years, this fleet had deployed in fragmented detachments, desperately plugging the bleeding wounds of a fractured Imperium. Now, they moved as a single, unstoppable spearhead. At the absolute center of the formation flew the Bloodcaller, and standing at its prow was Sanguinius, his pristine white wings folded against the void, a beacon of terrifying, impossible perfection. As the navigator engaged the colossal warp drives, the transition into the Imperium was unlike anything described in the horrific legends of the lower decks. Normally, to tear a hole in reality and enter the warp is to invite the screaming madness of the demon into your mind, requiring massive Jella fields to keep the predatory shadows at bay. But as the fabric of real space tore open, we did not plunge into a roiling, chaotic ocean of nightmare. We entered a realm that had been violently subjugated. The God Emperor's ascension on Terra, fueled by the weaponized, fanatical faith of quadrillions of human souls, had fundamentally altered the dimension of the dark gods. The Astronomican was no longer a desperate, flickering candle in a hurricane of suffering. It was a roaring, blinding pillar of solid golden fire that scorched the corrupted essence of the warp to silent ash. The psychic resonance of the Emperor's ultimate forgiveness toward Horus had starved the chaotic entities of their most potent fuel, leaving the Imperium a pacified, burning highway for his divine will. The journey was completely smooth, devoid of the scratching, whispering horrors that usually plagued the minds of the astropaths. We sailed upon a sea of pure, concentrated holy light, driven by a father who had become a god, and led by a son who had become his ultimate archangel. I looked down at my hands, the ingrained dirt of the subterranean crypt entirely erased, replaced by the smooth, healthy flesh of a man reborn. I had spent my entire life believing that the universe was a dying, uncaring void, and that my only duty was to quietly maintain a grave until the end of all things. I was wrong. The grave was empty. The master of mankind had awakened. He had embraced the sprawling faith of his children, and he had reached across the stars to pull his greatest weapon back from the dark. The long, weeping night of the Blood Angels was over, and the Golden Crusade had officially begun. We were no longer marching to delay the inevitable extinction of humanity. We were marching to aggressively reclaim the stars, and the galaxy would never be the same.